Security along the Belt and Road is becoming an increasingly important issue for China, and Frank O'Donnell, Postdoctoral Fellow of the National Security Affairs Department at the US Naval War College at Rhode Island, is looking at this. We discuss this as well as the significance of the new security guarantee principle by China, as well as the USA's counter-development strategy, the BUILD Act.
I'm Frank O'Donnell, Postdoctoral Fellow at the National Security Affairs Department at the US Naval War College, also a consultant and non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. I focus on Southern Asian security, mostly the nuclear and conventional force developments of India, China, and Pakistan. However, China is having a greater role in South Asia, and in particular in the form of Belt and Road. So I've also been following that more and more as part of my ongoing research.
And please can you discuss the security needs for China's Belt and Road Initiative, where they're most acute and why?
The security needs for Belt and Road is they are greatly concerned with the Malacca Strait and the prospect of there being any closure from that. I think that 70% of China's oil supplies, if I'm not wrong, transit through the Malacca Strait. And this explains a lot of China's general military strategy in recent years. Its conversion into blue ocean, blue-watered, expansionary naval capacity is fairly new in terms of Chinese maritime thinking. It's pushed into the Indian Ocean. And that's partly in regard to being able to have a certain level of presence around the Malacca Strait. And where Belt and Road fits into this as part of that overall perspective is that if push comes to shove and there's some coercive blockade of Chinese vessels or commerce to the Malacca Strait, what are we going to do? With the island chain to the east of China, Japan, and then further out, there's the risk of a U.S. blockade there. So Belt and Road helps China begin to diversify its ultimate commercial routes that it relies upon to keep its economy going. So one form is the CPEC passage that allows China to have a rail and road corridor that then goes through Pakistan to Gwadar, giving it an outlet into the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf that could be used as a backstop to the Malacca Strait. It's true that in terms of capacity, this wouldn't approach anything near what the Malacca Strait carries, but it's better than nothing. And another is the Silk Road Initiative traveling through Central Asia to Western Europe. That would allow, again, China to be able to have a transport route that is not reliant on the Malacca Strait. So it's partly just about diversification, and that China is aware of the fact that the Malacca Strait is a real choke point for it, and it needs to think about how it can diversify to make sure that no power can fully cut itself off in the event of a crisis.
And what is the new security guarantee principle, and how does this reflect our view of BRI?
Yeah, this was stated a few months ago, I believe late last year, by the Chinese government, and it's very interestingly phrased because on the one hand, China promises to several countries that are the recipients of BRI projects that the purpose of it will be solely civilian. China is not going to use this for any kind of secret military basing. There's not going to be any military transport there. However, it was announced as a general principle that China was willing to provide security guarantees for all Belt and Road projects. What this means in reality is that given that each of the projects is almost de facto a Chinese enclave by itself, it's Chinese construction companies, it's Chinese labor, it's Chinese materials. What a security guarantee is, it will be Chinese forces that are providing the guarantee to the project itself. We see indicators of this with regard to Pakistan, where Pakistan has is raising a 10,000 strong new formation to guard CPEC projects, but the PLA simply don't trust this, and instead have inserted their own troops there. And so this security guarantee promise was expressed generally. It'll apply to all BRI projects generally. And it means it gives China a pretext to have, for example, naval ships standing close by, to have PLA troops in and around where the BRI project area is, simply to provide adequate security.
And you focus quite a lot on what we've discussed so far on sort of the Indian Ocean and the surrounding littoral. How important do you think, I mean, BRI is of course a global strategy across the Afro-Eurasian and increasingly sort of Latin American region. How important though do you think understanding what's going on around the Indian Ocean is to understanding BRI as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Indian Ocean component is really crucial, and there's been a lot of recent developments there that suggest it should be closely watched. I think the main thing that I think has been surprisingly overlooked so far is the announcement by Malaysia a few months ago that it would outright cancel the Belt and Road projects that were signed and contracted with China, violating the terms of the contract. And they would simply keep the investments that were there, they would keep the infrastructure that was built, and they would cancel the contract. This could be seen as de facto nationalization. And when journalists asked the Malaysian government about, are you concerned about China's response to this? What are you going to do with regard to China? They said, we'll deal with it, or we'll see. They indicated really we're not that concerned about it, and if necessary, we'll face them down. And so I thought at the time when this happened that every other BRI recipient state would be watching Malaysia very closely in terms of what China's response to this would be. Because if other states respond like this, the house of cards could collapse with regard to if China simply allows this to happen, where a state simply takes the money and the infrastructure and then nationalizes it 5 or 10 years later or immediately, and China fails to respond coercively or in any way, what's going to happen? Also, one of the major shortcomings in BRI as Beijing sees it is the fact that India is not part of it, and Beijing analysts really want India to be part of it to give it a certain amount of credibility, but also because they're aware that India can interfere with a lot of what's going on in terms of China's efforts to construct this network across the Indian Ocean, and with India being a hostile state to that, being able to limit what's happening. Other aspects of BRI include the Hambantota port with Sri Lanka, the development of a new port and infrastructure in Chittagong in Bangladesh. These are some of the major BRI projects that are being launched. So a lot of the success of BRI, I think, will be dependent upon what happens in the Indian Ocean region, and also how China chooses to respond to this.
And Hambantota has been touted as an example of China trying to use the Belt and Road Initiative as almost a loan-to-own strategy. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this is a fair assessment, and perhaps more importantly, do you think Hambantota is a good example of what China's wanting to achieve through the Belt and Road?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think that Belt and Road there are multiple drivers underlying, but the first is strategic, and the Hambantota port turnaround came because Sri Lanka realized the debt burden that it was under. The Sri Lankan government officials, by their own admission, had not looked at the fine print of the contract specifically before signing off on it. And they went to Beijing to ask for a renegotiation of the terms of the loan. And Beijing said that we will cut off, I believe, 15% of the either the capital or the interest of the loan in return for us receiving a 99-year lease to Hamantota. So the problem is this kind of conflicts with a lot of what the Chinese rhetoric and messaging is around Belt and Road, in that it's ultimately about soft power. It's about China using its huge economic resources for the benefit of the region to be able to develop the region and use Chinese engineering expertise, technical expertise, and money to help develop a region of mutual prosperity. If that were true, and if Sri Lanka had approached China, and if this soft power idea and these ideas are really consistent, I think, within Beijing, China would have simply renegotiated the loan to allow more lenient terms in and of itself. The fact that China instead essentially got territorial control of a very strategically important port in the Indian Ocean, I think, is telling about what Beijing sees BRI as.
In some of your work, you've highlighted that a way to counter or react to China's Belt and Road strategy is to set up, or for the US and Western Europe to set up alternative financing mechanisms and also to fund infrastructure in some of the Belt and Road countries. A lot of these countries, though, their political systems are more aligned with China's. And what effect do you think this could have when the standards and norms of these countries are closer to that of China?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting parallel in that if you look at how BRI became so successful in South Asia, not just in Pakistan, but in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, is that India has long been the regional big state. And the South Asian states view India, the smaller South Asian states view India very negatively. They see it as being a bully that interferes in these states whenever it suits them, and is really just uses coercive leverage a lot of the time in Indian interests. And what China can do is that it can appear as the benign, friendly external partner that will say, we will help you develop different parts of your infrastructure, but there's not going to be really any ulterior motives. This isn't going to be about us expanding influence within your country like India wants to. This isn't going to be about us trying to dominate the region as India is consistently wanting to. We just simply want to help you develop your infrastructure, and we also have the kind of money and just general resources that India, and just sustained geopolitical focus that India doesn't have with regard to the region. My point is that China can appear as the friendly external partner that can help lift these states out of a difficult position, being the domination of India over the region. Now, to draw that parallel further out, BRI is being paid for by loans to these states, which these states have to repay to Chinese financial institutions and ultimately to China's government. I've already spoken about Malaysia, I've already spoken about Sri Lanka, but as these loans come due and as China demonstrates that it can vary the interest rates on its loans with regard to how much pressure it wants to place on the recipient government, it places the U.S. and Western Europe in a terrific position because they can follow the China model with regard to South Asia. Western Europe and the U.S. can say, we will help develop this infrastructure, we will offer perhaps better rates, loans at lower interest, even grants to help develop this infrastructure. And you won't have to worry about being locked into a Chinese debt cycle like you are right now. There's a real opportunity there because ultimately all of these states none of these states want to become solely dependent upon China. They want to have flexibility, they want to have multiple states investing in them. And so there's a natural magnet that can draw the US and Western Europe in if they have the willingness and resources to commit to this.
when we talk about China and the Belt and Road, of course, we have to sort of distinguish between the different actors within the political system and the different commercial banks or policy banks which are financing this. Are you able to provide any examples of the ways in which different SOEs are acting in different projects, or different ways in which these projects are financed, or is that something you'd be happy to discuss?
Yeah, the structure of the contracts, and this is where I point you in the direction of that excellent report that came out called Harvard Ambitions a few months ago. The structure of the contracts is a loan will come from a major Chinese financial institution, and with that loan, the country has to purchase the labor, the infrastructure works, the actual contract itself in terms of engineering, construction, infrastructure for a major Chinese construction company. And also, while paying back the loan in itself. So it's ultimately just about China, about the money simply just circling back into China. It's Chinese labor, it's Chinese engineering firms, and as we know, the Chinese government has varying degrees of control over all aspects of the Chinese economy, but especially those that are going to be involved in BRI projects.
And the Doklam dispute in 2017 highlighted both some of the strategic tensions between China and India, but also the way in which China can use the building of roads.
Yes.
In terms of border disputes. Do you think you can separate these two factors, China's construction efforts and separating border disputes, or are these distinct?
Formally they should be separated in that the Doklam road extension project was about China trying to build to extend a military road further south to give it an important kind of overlook advantage over the Siliguri corridor in India, this very thin strip of land that separates the northeastern states of India from the rest of the Indian mainland. If they had extended this road successfully, then they would have been able to move significant military material there and easily be able to, for example, in the event of a crisis, to bombard that corridor to essentially cut it off. That was a military project. It was formally distinct from Belt and Road. However, to Indian policymakers and also to other, policymakers in the region, not just in India, it can get wrapped into this overwhelming anxiety about overall Chinese penetration. That either through Belt and Road or through military projects like this, China is extending its physical presence throughout the Indian Ocean region, throughout South Asia, throughout Central Asia. And again, it's up to China about how it manages its diplomacy on this, but it's up to China about how these states see China's activities as being malign or beneficial for the region. Instances like Doklam and the kind of rhetoric that came out of Beijing during Doklam, which was using language we haven't seen for decades in its ferocity. Instances like the Hambantota port and what happened to that are not reassuring if China wants to project a positive soft power image of Belt and Road truly being about economic cooperation for mutual benefit. So they can get wrapped together, and they do get wrapped together as part of just China wishing to expand its aegis of influence. And the problem with incidents like Doklam is that they can help characterize what this aegis of influence looks like.
And focusing on the relationship or even strategic rivalry between China and India, what risk or what effect can the Belt and Road Initiative have on nuclear proliferation or nuclear tensions in the region? Because I know that's one of your focuses.
Yeah. With regard to nuclear proliferation, this has always been the pattern, but it does commit China to an even greater degree to Pakistan's security. and this also involved its nuclear security. So China is presently arranged a deal with Pakistan to sell it 8 dual-use submarines, which most analysts expect will become ultimately Pakistan's sea-based nuclear deterrent. But looking at it more broadly in terms of conventional crises that could quickly have nuclear implications, India has long been focused upon developing a conventional concept that would have a short, sharp incursion into Pakistan called Cold Start, in which they would seize 60 to 80 kilometers of land with very fast-moving mechanized formations, and then hold on to that land for bargaining leverage against Pakistan. Where China and Belt and Road begin to change this is that Chinese soldiers, PLA soldiers, are spread throughout Pakistan, and it's difficult to imagine any kind of Indian consequential attack that will not inadvertently affect or touch or hurt or kill Chinese troops. So the Chinese troops there can act as a tripwire in terms of any subsequent India-Pakistan conflict, simply by merit of them being in Pakistan. At the same time, as a way to counteract this Indian Cold Start concept of this fast-moving incursion, Pakistan has developed what they call the Nasser Tactical Nuclear Weapons Platform, which they say will be forward deployed and, if necessary, used to stop this Indian attack if it happens. In the middle of all this is China. So one thing that will complicate the next India-Pakistan crisis, if it comes, will be the fact that China, by merit of its much larger physical presence now in Pakistan, and as well as the desire to make sure that all its projects, the corridor is not interrupted or interfered with in any way, is going to play a much bigger role in conflict resolution between India and Pakistan. Recently, in the last few crises, that role has fallen to the U.S., where the U.S. acts as the broker to form, the face-saving agreement that allows both India and Pakistan to stand down. However, in the next crisis, it looks more likely to have to be a combination of U.S. and China doing this, as well as all the military complications I just spoke about there. So it will get, as if it wasn't complicated enough before, it will get more complicated. And China will be directly involved in the next India-Pakistan crisis much more quickly, and ultimately whether or not it would want to be in the first place.
And just to finish, if you were going to conceptualize the Belt and Road Initiative in one word, and also if you're happy to, one image, what would these be to you?
One word is difficult. I would just say influence. With regard to one image, I would focus upon CPEC. This is really kind of the flagship project of Belt and Road. It's the most comprehensive project in terms of countries, and specifically the idea to build a corridor going through Pakistan to Gwadar, giving it this outlet onto the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. And that this corridor is lined with PLA soldiers, and that it's being developed primarily to give China that alternate route for military traffic, for commercial traffic, to avoid a Malacca Strait cutoff. That image, taken in its totality, I think, wraps up what Belt and Road ultimately is.